Picture this. It's a balmy Roman evening in the spring of 67 AD. The golden light filters through colonnades of marble as the streets hum with the chatter of citizens and the rhythmic clang of sandals on stone. And then, silence. Hush rolls through the crowd like a cold wind. Everyone turns to look. The Emperor Nero has arrived, draped in royal purple, his expression smug, almost bored till you see who walks beside him. A young woman, beautiful. Regal, draped in translucent silk, adorned in sapphires and pearls. But those close enough to whisper already know the truth. That woman wasn't born a woman. That young figure trailing behind the emperor, adjusting her gown and keeping pace with a delicate grace, was once a boy. His name was Sporus, and the reason Nero castrated him is far darker than any history lesson ever dared to teach. This is not just a scandal from antiquity a story of obsession so twisted it bends reality. It is a love story hollowed out by grief and inflated by power, until it became something else entirely. A grotesque performance written, directed, and enforced by an emperor who could command the sun to rise if it suited his narrative. But to understand why Nero took a knife not just to a boy's body, but to his identity, we have to start with what Nero lost. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. She wasn't Nero's first wife, nor his last, but she was undoubtedly the one who carved herself deepest into his psyche. She was elegance personified, a political schemer with charm polished to a mirror shine. Her beauty was spoken of like prophecy, her presence magnetic. She didn't just walk into a room, she conquered it. Nero fell hard and fast, like a falling star plummeting without restraint. And when he looked at Poppaea, he didn't see a woman. He saw a goddess made flesh, a reflection of his own divinity, his mirror. Nero had always loved mirrors. Not the glass kind, but the kind that reflected his desires, his delusions, his unquenchable hunger for control. Poppaea was perfect because she didn't challenge his view of the world, at least not at first. She played the part. She played it so well, in fact, that Nero believed it. He divorced his previous wife, Octavia, a respectable and politically useful partner, and had her exiled and eventually executed. Why? Because Octavia was a dull instrument, and Nero craved a symphony. With Poppaea, he got it. She became empress, and their wedding was an orgy of opulence. Rose petals fell from ceilings. Musicians played for hours without rest. Dishes from across the empire were served in succession, each more decadent than the last. Rome trembled under the weight of Nero's fantasy, but fantasies, even imperial ones, are fragile. They shatter when touched by reality. Poppaea, for all her poise, had a tongue, and she used it. She criticized, she scolded. She reminded Nero that being emperor wasn't just a performance, it came with duties. She chastised him for missing meetings, for chasing applause on stage while Rome's foundations cracked. And worst of all, she didn't do it behind closed doors. She did it in front of others. It wasn't treason, it was worse. It was humiliation. And then came the night. the night that would echo for years through Nero's broken mind. Pregnant again, argued with him. Sources differ on the cause. Maybe it was his infidelities or his theatrical ambitions, but the outcome remains the same. In a rage, he struck her, perhaps a single brutal kick to the belly, perhaps more. What's certain is that by morning, the empress, the goddess, was dead. And so was their unborn child. Grief has stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Nero got stuck in the first three and skipped the rest. He ordered her body embalmed and kept it in a shrine like a sacred relic. He declared her divine and demanded everyone else pretend she still lived. Servants continued to set her place at dinner. Courtiers referred to her in the present tense. And those who didn't, they disappeared. Grief in Nero's palace was mandatory, and it was delusional. But time, even in madness, ticks on. And into that ticking silence stepped a boy, Sporus, barely a teenager, raised within the palace walls. Educated, yes, but more importantly, beautiful, delicately boned, large expressive eyes, and cruelly a resemblance to Poppaea, so uncanny that it made some question whether the gods were mocking Nero with a ghost in male form. When Nero laid eyes on Sporus, something inside him snapped into place. He didn't see a servant. He saw resurrection. He saw a second chance. Way to unmake the past and restage the perfect performance. But first he had to remove the lie, the boy's maleness, the final barrier between illusion and reality. And so, in the quiet halls of the imperial palace, preparations began for a transformation that would be as irreversible as it was agonizing. It began with the physicians. Nero summoned Rome's most skilled and most desperate doctors. He gave them a task that would horrify any sane man: to remake a living person into a statue of memory. Not metaphorically, literally. Surgery, castration, not as punishment, but as preservation. As creation, the boy would become Poppaea, reborn. Imagine it. A cold stone room. A boy no older than 15 held down by guards. Surgical instruments laid out on a bronze table. No anesthesia, only wine and opium. And outside, beyond the doors, an emperor waiting not for news of success or failure, but for confirmation that his fantasy had been made flesh. That he had rewritten reality. The surgery succeeded. If success is defined as survival, Sporus lived. But the boy who had entered that room was gone, replaced by something else. Something that walked, breathed, even smiled, but no longer belonged to itself. He was given a new name, Sabina, Nero's lost wife, reborn in satin and pearls. And then came the wedding. The wedding was not a private affair. It was a spectacle, the kind Rome had never seen before and would never quite forget. Nero, God-Emperor, was marrying his lost love, or at least a fabricated reflection of her. Now renamed Sabina, was dressed in a gown crafted from golden threaded silk imported from Parthia. His hair was curled and styled to match the last surviving bust of Papa Ya. And around his neck hung pearls that once belonged to the dead empress, as if her spirit could be stitched onto him, gem by gem. The guests came in droves. Senators, generals, foreign envoys, and courtiers filled the great hall, each feigning delight, each terrified of betraying even a flicker of disbelief. They toasted the couple. They praised Sabina's beauty. They congratulated Nero for his loyalty to love, even in death. But beneath the painted smiles and trembling goblets, everyone knew what they were watching was not a wedding. It was a funeral in reverse, a resurrection, a madness with a crown. Rome was no stranger to perversion, but this was different. Here stood the emperor of the greatest civilization on earth, not only marrying a teenage boy, but demanding that the entire empire agree. He was marrying a woman, a very specific woman, who had died by his own hand. Sporus was required to answer to Poppaea's name, to smile as she smiled, to walk in her sandals, to dress in her gowns, to sleep in her bed, to share her memories as if they were his own. The emperor's madness had found its perfect stage, and Sporus had become its lead actress. What choice did he have? From that day forward, Sporus lived as Sabina in every waking moment. He was given a private chamber within the palace, filled with tapestries, perfumes, and bronze mirrors that reflected not himself but a stranger's design. Servants called him Lady. Musicians played her favorite songs during meals. Artists painted him in the poses of Poppaea's old portraits. And all the while, Nero watched with manic intensity, searching for signs that his fantasy was working. The boy truly had become the woman he destroyed. Sporus learned quickly that survival meant performance. He studied every movement Papa Ya had once made, pieced together from whispered stories, old statues, and Nero's volatile memory. He learned to giggle at the right moments, to cast his eyes down demurely, to adjust his voice into soft lilts and flattering tones. He stopped speaking of his own childhood. He stopped asking questions. He stopped correcting the emperor when he reminisced about events Sporus had never experienced. Eventually, he stopped wondering who he had been before the transformation. Wondering hurt more than pretending. And yet, even within this grotesque theater, there were moments, quiet, terrifying moments, when the illusion cracked. Nero would sometimes weep at night, clutching Sporus to his chest, muttering apologies to Papa Ya. He would whisper confessions, that he missed her scent, her wit, the way she mocked his poetry with a smirk. Sporus would lie there, still as a statue, saying nothing, because there was nothing he could say. Because Nero didn't want a conversation, he wanted a ghost. These nightly rituals became their own kind of prison. Sporus wasn't merely being used, he was being erased. Every time Nero caressed his cheek and whispered Sabina, it was another layer of his identity scraped away. He began to avoid mirrors altogether. He recoiled at the sight of his reflection in the polished bronze, not because it was grotesque, but because it was convincing. In public, Sporus was paraded like a trophy. Nero took him everywhere. The theater, gladiatorial games, temples. At every appearance, he was dressed in Poppia's fashion, escorted by handmaidens, seated beside the emperor. Foreign dignitaries bowed before him. Poets sang his beauty in verses written under duress. The people cheered because the guards stood ready to punish those who didn't. It was all a mask painted, powdered, perfumed. But a mask worn long enough becomes a face. Then came Greece. In 67 AD, Nero announced his grand tour of the Hellenistic world. He fancied himself not only an emperor, but an artist, a musician, a poet, a charioteer, and like any deluded artist, he wanted adoration. So he brought his court with him, including Sporus, who now had to perform his role not just in Rome, but across the Mediterranean. Everywhere they went, Nero insisted on theatrical pageantry. In Athens, he staged mock weddings. In Corinth, he competed in musical competitions rigged to ensure he won. In Delphi, he offered sacrifices at the temple of Apollo, claiming kinship with the gods. And by his side, always, was Sporus dressed in flowing white, carrying flowers, eyes cast downward, the perfect empress. To the Greeks, who prided themselves on rationalism and philosophical inquiry, this was not just bizarre, was sacrilegious. They saw through the performance instantly. The whispers spread quickly. They called Sporus the living corpse, the emperor's doll, the boy bride. But they kept their voices low, their criticisms veiled, because Nero's wrath was swift and brutal. The months wore on, the performances multiplied. Sporus began to deteriorate. His health faltered. His smiles grew thinner. His hands trembled at public appearances. Those close enough to see the truth noticed the hollowness behind his eyes. He had become a prisoner in satin robes, a puppet, a ghost. And then, like all tyrannies, Nero's empire began to unravel. In 68 AD, revolts ignited across the Roman provinces. The legions, once loyal to the emperor, turned against him. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Even the Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Nero's palace, once buzzing with sycophants and actors, became a tomb of silence and betrayal. He fled the city with only a handful of companions. Among them, Sporus. Even at the end, Nero couldn't let go. He clutched Sporus like a relic, as if the boy's presence could ward off the empire's collapse. They hid in a countryside villa, surrounded by the echoes of power once absolute. Nero made plans for escape, then for suicide. He paced the halls, ranting about betrayal, about art, about gods and ghosts. And Sporus, still dressed as Sabina, watched it all in quiet resignation. Eventually, when word arrived that soldiers were approaching, Nero took his own life. A dagger, a servant's assistance. The end of a mad emperor. And just like that, Sporus was free. Or so he thought. The death of Nero should have marked the end of Sporus' nightmare. The man who had mutilated him, renamed him, forced him into a performance of a dead woman's life was gone. But in Rome, power doesn't vanish. it transfers. And with it, so do the ghosts of those it possessed. Sporus, now a political orphan, found himself adrift in a sea of opportunists who viewed him not as a victim, but as a symbol, one wrapped in silken tragedy and still terrifyingly useful. Sporus was passed from hand to hand like imperial property. First, to Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian commander who had betrayed Nero and saw himself as the next emperor. Nymphidius, ever obsessed with legacy, publicly claimed that he too would marry Sporus, hoping to absorb some of Nero's divine mystique by mimicking his madness. Perhaps he thought the people would believe it, or worse, that Sporus himself would consent. But before the wedding could be staged, Nymphidius was murdered by his own guards. His delusions of grandeur died with him, but Sporus lived on, still costumed, still renamed, still trapped. Next came Otho, one of Nero's former allies and a man with his own twisted ambitions. Like Nero, he treated Sporus not as a person, but as a performance. He allowed him to continue living as Sabina, dressing as a woman, moving through Rome's elite circles like a cursed statue come to life. But even Otho's rule was short-lived, just 3 months before he, too, was swallowed by the chaos of civil war. And so Sporus passed again, this time into the custody of Emperor Vitellius. Vitellius was not mad in the way Nero had been. It was worse in some ways. Unimaginative, gluttonous, and cruel without flair. He saw Sporus not as a lost love or a tragic relic, but as an opportunity for humiliation. He didn't want to resurrect Poppaea. He wanted a circus, a spectacle, a public joke played on the remains of a dead dynasty. And he devised a final act for Sporus that would leave even Rome's blood-stained arenas hushed in disbelief. Vitellius announced that Sporus would take part in a public reenactment of the myth of Proserpinade, the goddess of spring who was kidnapped and raped by Pluto, the god of the underworld. It was a cruel parody, staged not as religious ritual, but as mass entertainment. And in this twisted retelling, Sporus would play Proserpina, not as a goddess, but as a victim. It was to be performed in the arena, before thousands. A mock abduction? A simulated rape? Perhaps even more. Roman crowds were fickle. They cheered cruelty as long as it was novel. And nothing was more novel than the boy-woman who once sat beside emperors, now degraded for their amusement. But Sporus never took the stage. The day before the performance, he took his own life. No final speech, no grand farewell, just silence. He likely used poison easy enough to come by in a palace teeming with political paranoia. And in that final act, Sporus did what he had not been allowed to do in years. He chose, ended the performance. He walked off the stage before the final curtain could fall. Was likely no more than 20 years old. Historians rarely agree on much. But there is one thing most ancient chroniclers admit, however reluctantly. Sporus was a tragedy, not a villain, not a seducer. A boy stripped of choice, identity, and humanity turned into a breathing monument to one man's madness. He wasn't born to be remembered. He was sculpted into memory by force, and then discarded. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, they all mention Sporus, but always as an accessory, as evidence of Nero's perversion. As a symbol of decadence, none paused to wonder who he really was before he was turned into Sabina. What his voice sounded like before it was trained to sound sweet. What dreams he had before he became someone else's dream. Silence is the greatest cruelty of all. Because somewhere inside the dresses, the wigs, the gold ornaments, and marble halls, there was a boy. A boy who had once laughed without thinking about pitch, who had once spoken without fearing correction, who had once looked in the mirror and seen a future that belonged to him. That boy is gone, and the world, obsessed as it was with Nero's madness, never truly mourned him. What we should. Because Sporus is not just a footnote in the saga of roaming depravity. He is a warning about the power of fantasy, about what happens when grief becomes delusion, and delusion gains power. He is a reminder that love, untempered by boundaries, can become ownership. That admiration can become obsession, and that obsession, when wielded by someone with absolute control, becomes violence, quiet, relentless, ceremonial violence. Nero didn't castrate Sporus because he loved him. He castrated him because he loved no one but himself. Sporus was the canvas on which he painted his regret, his guilt, his fantasies. And like any tool in the hands of a god king, he was used until he broke. His suicide wasn't just escape, it was protest. It was the one thing he did with complete agency. A whisper of rebellion in a life where every word had been scripted by someone else. In the ruins of Rome, where statues crumble and marble fades, no monument stands for Sporus. But maybe that's fitting. Maybe his monument is the story itself, the grim reminder of what happens when identity becomes theater, and when humanity is traded for spectacle. As you walk away from this story, remember this. The empire that called itself eternal was built on lives like his, unseen, unnamed, unfree, and somewhere, across time and stone, the echo of his final choice still lingers. Not as a scream, but as a silence that demands to be heard.